So today's sermon will be kind of in two parts. There were two of the three readings this morning that really kind of latched onto me, and they didn't, like they sometimes do, come together at all. So there's going to be a volume 1, volume 2. But don't worry, it'll fit in the same time footprint. Don't panic. But I want to start with the first reading and maybe just a little additional background. We have a first reading, a second reading, and a gospel text. In the old days, we would say an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, and a gospel. But that has gone away for a number of reasons, one of which is it's not always from the Old Testament. So today, we have a first reading that comes from the book of Acts of the Apostles. And so we are hearing about the earliest days of the church, and that's a typical kind of reading that we might hear during this season of Easter. We're hearing about the church in its very earliest days. So I want you to think about that a little differently. This is kind of our prehistory. We read from the Gospels about the life of Jesus, and we read from the Gospels about the disciples following Jesus, but it feels, at least to me, a little distant. I don't necessarily put myself in the shoes of the actual 12 apostles wandering around with Jesus, seeing these things. But suddenly, we shift to the book of Acts, and suddenly we're in a completely different spot. We're in the time after Jesus' earthly ministry. And we're hearing about the earliest church leaders doing church kinds of things. And it feels somehow less distant, like a part of our narrative, a part of our story. The thing that I want to mention in regards to this reading that we have today from Acts in particular is, what is the church doing after the story of Easter? Right? We're in the season of Easter here. We have several weeks. The gospel text reminds us that we've run out of actual Easter stories. We hear about Jesus being raised from the dead. We hear about doubting Thomas, the road to Emmaus, fish for breakfast on the lakeshore, and then suddenly we're out of those readings and have to shift to the ones like we have this morning. But after Pentecost, after Christ has ascended into heaven, and the disciples now are left to their own devices, and they're sitting down at a conference table and saying, okay, I guess we're making this thing called a church now. What should this look like? Now, we have sisters and brothers in the faith, the other sheep, perhaps, at least in part, that we might hear from the gospel text, who would say, well, the first thing we got to do is find out who's going to be the pope. Now, I'm not sure that would have been Jesus' immediate first concern, but it is interesting that we should hear from Peter in the reading that we have this morning, often looked back to as the first leader of the church. But the question that I want you to think about this week in regards to this reading is, what is the church doing? What are the things that the church is about in those earliest days after Easter? There's a pretty short answer to this. They're doing the exact same things that Jesus was doing. They were feeding people who were hungry. They were healing the sick. And in fact, related to today's readings, perhaps not on the day of the week they were supposed to be doing it. They were making a difference in the world, one life at a time, doing the exact same things that Jesus did. And I don't want you to think that that was necessarily automatic. There could have been a scenario where Jesus said, I did all this amazing stuff that you can't possibly do, so I've got a shorter list of easier things for you to do instead. I would like you as the church for the rest of history to spend most of your time judging your neighbor and figuring out how far short of the goal that they come. Except that's not the narrative that we have. In fact, I heard a great line. It said, John 3:17, the lesser known sibling of John 3:16, where we hear that Jesus was sent into the world not to condemn the world. And if God didn't send Jesus to condemn the world, God probably did not send us to condemn the world either. Not our job. Although we might hear that from corners of the Christian world. So what are we supposed to be about? The stories of the Gospels. That we heal the sick, we feed the hungry. We discover in the very earliest of days of Christian followers after Pentecost, gathering every week on the first day of the week, remembering Easter, to share the stories of Jesus, that resources might be gathered so that they can be shared, that a meal would be shared, that there would be prayers for those who are sick, those who are in prison. We should be doing the kinds of things that Jesus did. And fortunately, we've got 4 Gospels to tell us about those things. Shifting gears to the Gospel text. John, to me, is a little harder gospel to crack than the others. This is the year of Mark, which is kind of almost the other extreme of the Gospels, where we have a simple gospel that's short, kind of moves from one thing to the next. Everything is immediate. It's almost like it's a bullet point story of the life of Jesus. And John he's a big thinker and a big theologian, and there are a lot of things going on in John's text. But one of John's favorite themes is this idea of a shepherd and sheep. In today's text, we hear about Jesus as the shepherd, and we hear about the hired hands. The hired hands are not great. You probably got that in the story there. They're not the ones that we're aspiring to, and we have to ask, well, who are the hired hands? If Jesus is referencing the hired hands, who are they? Who are these hired hands? There is some sense in the Gospels that it would be the religious leaders of the day. And I say it that way intentionally, because as a religious leader, it would not be the right thing to do to not reflect on that text. What does it mean? What does it mean to follow Jesus in a way that has to do with shepherding God's people? The word pastor is a Latin word that means shepherd, is what the word means. This image of caring for one another. But you notice in the text that Jesus is referencing at its most extreme. This isn't a story about a shepherd having to really struggle to find the best place for the sheep to graze or where the water might be good. No, this is a story about wolves. This is a story where the life of the sheep is at stake, and the shepherd has to be in action to save the life of the sheep. This isn't some domestic kind of scenario, but more of a wild sort of thing. And we as human beings, we don't like to think of ourselves as sheep. I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, they would, at the beginning of the year, in a get-to-know-you sort of way, ask us to write down what animals we most identified with, right? And see, the teacher, I guess, would discern a little bit about us in how we would write and what we would write. There weren't a lot of sheep written down. Chickens, groundhogs, dolphins were popular, but I'm more like a wolf, tiger, bear, right? Strong, tough. But at the same time, how often in this life, almost right up against a time when we do feel tough or on top of our game, do we suddenly feel very, very vulnerable and weak? Something comes alongside of us in a way that causes us to doubt the way in which we move through this life and world. Maybe it's in a visit to the doctor. Maybe it's a reshuffling at the company that we work for. Maybe it's struggling in a class that we thought would be simple for us. There's any number of ways, including even simply, literally stumbling and being less certain of our footing. There are all kinds of ways when we realize that as human beings, we may move through this life in a way that feels like we are impervious to what is going on around us, and then moments when we realize, wow, this life can be fleeting and challenging. And it's not a narrative where I am the only author, but rather there are chapters that I didn't want in my book, right? When we think of the gospel text for today, in the forum we're going to be talking a bit about the other sheep that are referenced in the text. Sometimes when we are feeling most confident, those are the times when we can be less gracious and open to those who might be struggling around us. The image that I think is important when we read this text and think about ourselves perhaps as sheep, we hear about other sheep, is a way of moving through this life that realizes that the people around us, or the people that we bump into in our daily lives, or the people that we might see in the news or any other place, are human beings like us, made in the image of God, whose background and upbringing and language and orientation and any number of things might be different from who we are. But at the end of the day, they too are children of God. And Christ calls us to start with the things that are the same, not the things that are different. Do you notice, and I try to look at the text in this way, when it's written the way it is and not in some other way? How could this text be written differently? It could be that there are sheep that follow the voice of Christ, right? The shepherd with the sheep. The other sheep could have been other animals entirely, right? Maybe there's a field somewhere that's full of llamas, who knows? Where it might heighten this idea of other, different, as opposed to the idea, no, other sheep, like you, like me, like us. So as you go about this week, as we move through the fourth Sunday of 7 in this season of Easter, recognizing the new life of Christ when it was unexpected, unanticipated. A reminder that as God's people, two things. We are called to be about the things that Jesus was about in this time and in this place. And as well, we are not impervious in this life. Perhaps we don't like thinking of ourselves as sheep, but a reminder that all of the people that we come into contact with are like us, struggling to move through this life in need of good news and hope, and that all those we bump into may not be outside the flock of Christ, but beloved by Christ just as we are. Amen. Please stand as you are able.